There's a cost to staying exactly where you are. Most people never stop long enough to truly calculate it. They assume that standing still is safe, that if they're not losing ground, they must at least be holding steady. But that assumption falls apart the moment you look at it honestly. Because the moment growth stops, loss quietly begins. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, silently, without interruption. At first, it shows up in ways that are easy to ignore. A little less excitement about your work, a little more irritation with ordinary problems, a subtle feeling that your days are starting to blur together. Nothing is terribly wrong, but nothing feels right either. That's where the danger lives. Because familiarity is one of the most deceptive states a person can live in. It feels like stability. It feels safe. It feels controlled. But in reality, it's often just stagnation wearing a comfortable mask. Your routine continues. Your responsibilities get handled. Your calendar fills and empties and fills again. And at the end of it all, you find yourself in the same place you were a year ago. That's not stability. That's drift. Drift disguised as consistency. Real stability doesn't come from staying the same. It comes from progress. From knowing you're building something, learning something, becoming something. Without that, what's left isn't peace. It's quiet deterioration, and that deterioration always comes with a cost. The cost isn't always obvious. Sometimes it shows up as a frustration you can't quite explain, a low-level dissatisfaction that follows you through your days. You might blame circumstances, other people, timing, bad luck. But more often than not, the real source is simpler. It's the quiet awareness, somewhere beneath everything, that more was possible and not enough was done to pursue it. That awareness doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It builds. Over time, it becomes weight. And carrying that weight creates a very specific kind of exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but mental, emotional, a kind of tiredness that doesn't go away with rest. Because it's not coming from effort. It's coming from the gap between effort and meaningful progress. You can be incredibly busy and still feel stuck. You can work long hours and still feel like nothing is moving forward. Because activity and progress are not the same thing. And deep down, you know the difference. That gap between what you're doing and what it's actually producing is one of the clearest signs that staying in place is costing you. The effort is there. The time is being spent. But the outcome doesn't justify the energy, and that realization slowly drains your motivation. What makes this even more dangerous is that the cost doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates, quietly, day by day. Each time you delay action, each time you say, "I'll start next week," each time you choose comfort over growth, a small charge is added. Individually, those charges seem insignificant, but over time, they compound. Days become weeks, weeks become months, months become years, and one day you look back and realize the cost has become massive. That moment of looking back is powerful because it forces a simple, unavoidable question: what has actually changed? Not what happened around you, not what others did, but what changed because of your choices, because of your actions. If the honest answer is not much, then staying where you are has been charging you the entire time. But here's where everything can shift, because awareness is the turning point. Not dramatic change, not overnight transformation, just clear, honest recognition. Recognition that the current path is no longer acceptable. That discomfort you feel, that's not something to avoid, it's something to use. Because discomfort that comes from clarity is valuable. It points directly at what needs to change. Most people avoid this kind of honesty, not because they're lazy, but because they're afraid of what they might find. So instead, they focus on effort, not results. They stay busy instead of evaluating whether that busyness is working. But avoiding the truth doesn't change the outcome. It only delays improvement because you cannot fix what you refuse to see. And here's the paradox. The thing people avoid, honest evaluation, is the very thing that creates progress. Because the moment you look directly at your results, they stop being something to explain and start becoming something to use. That's where growth actually begins, not with ability, not with motivation, but with recognition. Recognition that where you are is costing you something real, something measurable, something you wouldn't willingly give up if you truly saw it clearly. And when that realization becomes real, the decision to grow doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet. It feels steady. It feels certain. It's not a burst of motivation. It's a firm acknowledgement. This isn't working anymore. And something inside you closes the door on staying the same. From that point forward, the question is no longer whether to change. It becomes how to change. And that's a completely different conversation. At the same time, something else begins to shift. Your relationship with your results. You're no longer reacting to life. You're shaping it because you've accepted responsibility, not as an idea, but as a daily practice. This is where most people separate, not because of intelligence, not because of talent, but because of willingness. The willingness to see clearly, to stop making excuses, to stop negotiating with reality, and to take ownership. Because the truth is, results don't care about explanations. They don't adjust based on intention. They don't change because circumstances were difficult. They simply reflect what was done consistently. You can build the perfect explanation. You can justify every missed outcome, and nothing will change because explanation without correction is useless. Real change begins when the question shifts from "why did this happen?" to "what needs to change?" That shift changes everything because why looks backward. It searches for causes, but what needs to change looks forward. It creates solutions. When you operate from explanation, you're a detective. When you operate from correction, you're an architect. And only one of those builds a different future. This is where control returns, because instead of focusing on what you can't change, you focus on what you can, your actions, your habits, your decisions. And that leads to another critical shift, from preference to requirement. Most people live in preference. They prefer to improve, they prefer to be disciplined, they prefer to succeed. But preference is weak because it's optional. It works when conditions are easy and disappears when things get hard. Requirement is different. Requirement doesn't negotiate. Requirement doesn't depend on mood. Requirement acts regardless of conditions. And the shift from preference to requirement is the moment real change begins. It doesn't come from motivation. It comes from decision. A real decision. The kind that closes doors. Because a true decision doesn't leave alternatives open. It removes them. It ends negotiation. And when that happens, something powerful changes. You stop wasting energy deciding and start using energy executing. That's why commitment actually feels easier over time, not harder, because you're no longer debating yourself every day. And as that consistency builds, something else grows, self-trust. When you repeatedly follow through, you start believing in yourself again, not based on hope, but based on evidence. That confidence is different. It doesn't depend on outcomes. It depends on your ability to act, even when it's hard. And that's the foundation of everything. Because in the end, the life you build isn't shaped by what you intend. It's shaped by what you tolerate. What you tolerate becomes your standard. What your standard allows becomes your reality. And raising that standard isn't about doing more occasionally. It's about changing what's acceptable permanently. Because real change isn't intensity. It's consistency. It's showing up on ordinary days, when nothing feels exciting, when progress isn't visible, when motivation isn't there. That's where the standard becomes real. And over time, that consistency compounds. Until one day, you realize something has changed. Not in a dramatic moment, but in a steady transformation. You're no longer negotiating. You're no longer drifting. You're no longer explaining. You're building. And it all started with one thing, a clear decision that staying the same was no longer acceptable. There comes a point where you can no longer pretend you don't see it, where the patterns become too clear to ignore, where the results you're getting start matching the habits you've been repeating. And in that moment, something uncomfortable happens. You realize that the life you're living right now is not an accident. It's a reflection of what you've accepted, what you've delayed, what you've tolerated, and more importantly, what you've avoided. Avoidance is subtle.
It doesn't look like failure. It looks like, I'll deal with it later. It sounds like now isn't the right time. It feels like I just need to figure things out first. But underneath all of that, it's resistance. Resistance to change, resistance to discomfort, resistance to stepping into something that requires more from you than you're currently giving. And the problem with avoidance is this: it compounds just like action does. Every time you avoid something important, you train yourself to avoid it again. Every time you delay, you make delay easier the next time, until eventually, avoidance becomes your default. And once it becomes your default, your life starts shrinking, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, in terms of possibility. You stop aiming high, not because you can't reach it, but because you've gotten used to not trying. You lower expectations, not because you lack ability, but because it feels safer. You convince yourself that this is enough, when deep down, you know it isn't. That's the real cost. Not failure, not struggle, but settling. Settling is dangerous because it feels reasonable. It feels mature. It feels practical. It feels like you're being realistic. But often, it's just fear in disguise. Fear of failing, fear of being judged, fear of putting in effort and not seeing results. So instead of risking disappointment, you choose comfort. But comfort has a price, and that price is growth. The longer you stay in comfort, the harder growth becomes. Not because growth itself changes, but because you do. You get used to ease. You get used to convenience. You get used to not pushing yourself. And over time, even small challenges start to feel overwhelming. Things that once required effort now feel impossible. That's how stagnation traps people, not by force, but by slowly lowering their threshold for discomfort. And once that threshold is low enough, even the idea of change feels exhausting. But here's the truth most people don't want to face: change doesn't get easier by waiting. It gets harder, because while you're waiting, you're reinforcing the habits that keep you stuck. You're strengthening the patterns that hold you back. You're becoming more of the person who avoids change instead of the person who creates it. That's why the moment you recognize this matters so much, because recognition creates a choice, a real one. You can continue the pattern or you can interrupt it. Interrupting it doesn't require perfection. It doesn't require a complete life overhaul. It requires one thing: action. Not massive action, not dramatic action, but intentional action. Action that moves you forward, even slightly, even imperfectly. Because action does something powerful. It breaks the cycle. The moment you act, you prove to yourself that change is possible. You weaken the pattern of avoidance. You create momentum. And momentum is everything. Because once you start moving, it becomes easier to keep moving. Not because things get easier, but because you get stronger. That strength doesn't come from motivation. It comes from repetition, from showing up, from doing what you said you'd do, even when you don't feel like it. That's how discipline is built, not in big moments, but in small, consistent ones. Moments where you could choose comfort, but you choose effort instead. Moments where you could delay, but you act now. Moments where you could quit, but you continue. Those moments seem small, but they change everything, because every time you follow through, you reinforce a new identity. You stop being the person who avoids and start becoming the person who executes. Identity is powerful because once you see yourself differently, your behavior changes naturally. You don't have to force discipline. You become disciplined. You don't have to chase motivation. You act regardless of it. And once that shift happens, progress becomes inevitable. Not fast, not easy, but inevitable. Because consistency always wins. It beats talent. It beats luck. It beats bursts of motivation. Consistency compounds, and over time, it creates results that seem impossible from the outside. But from the inside, it's just daily effort, repeated over and over again. This is where patience becomes important. Because real growth is slow. Slower than you want. Slower than you expect. And that's where most people quit. Not because they're incapable, but because they expect faster results. They put in effort for a short time, don't see immediate change, and assume it's not working. But that's not how growth works. Growth is delayed. The effort you put in today doesn't show up tomorrow. It shows up later, which means you have to trust the process. You have to keep going, even when results aren't visible, even when progress feels small, even when it feels like nothing is changing, because something is changing. You are. Your habits are improving. Your discipline is strengthening. Your mindset is shifting. And eventually, those internal changes become external results. That's when everything starts to make sense. That's when the effort feels worth it, but you don't get there without pushing through the phase where nothing seems to happen. That phase is a test, not of your ability, but of your commitment. It asks one question: will you continue even without immediate reward? Most people won't. That's why most people stay the same. But the ones who do continue, the ones who keep showing up, even when it's hard, even when it's boring, even when it's uncomfortable, those are the ones who change their lives. Because they understand something most people don't. Progress isn't about intensity. It's about persistence. It's about doing the work long after the excitement is gone. It's about staying consistent when motivation disappears. It's about choosing growth over and over again. And eventually, that choice becomes who you are. At that point, you don't rely on feelings. You rely on standards. Standards that you refuse to break. Standards that define your actions. Standards that shape your life. And once your standards rise, your life follows, because you no longer accept less. You no longer tolerate excuses. You no longer settle. You expect more from yourself, and you deliver. That's the shift. From hoping things will change to making them change. From waiting for the right time to acting now. From drifting to directing. And once you step into that, there's no going back, because you've seen the truth. You've seen what staying the same costs. You've seen what avoiding action leads to. You've seen what happens when you settle, and once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. So the only question left is, what are you going to do about it? Because the opportunity is still here, right now, not tomorrow, not next week, not when conditions are perfect. Now. And the decision you make in this moment will shape everything that comes after. You don't need to do everything at once. You don't need to have it all figured out. You just need to start. One action, one step, one decision, and then another. That's how change begins. Not with a big moment, but with a small one. A moment where you choose differently. And that moment, if repeated enough, becomes a completely different life. And here's the part most people underestimate: how quickly things can start to change once you truly commit. Not in a dramatic, overnight transformation, but in direction. And direction is everything. Because for a long time, you may have been putting in effort without clarity, moving, but not progressing, working, but not building, trying, but not changing. But once your direction becomes clear, your effort stops being scattered. It becomes focused. And focused effort creates leverage. Instead of spreading your energy across distractions, you start applying it where it actually matters, where it produces results, where it compounds. And that's when progress starts to feel different. Not necessarily easier, but more meaningful. Because now, every action connects to something bigger. Every step has purpose. Every effort has direction. And that sense of direction removes a lot of the frustration, because confusion is exhausting. Uncertainty drains energy. Not knowing whether what you're doing matters creates doubt, but clarity changes that. When you know what you're working toward and you've decided that it's non-negotiable, you stop questioning every step. You just execute. And execution, done consistently, changes everything, because most people spend their time thinking about what they should do. Instead of doing it, they plan, they analyze, they prepare, but they don't act. And without action, nothing moves. Ideas don't change your life. Plans don't change your life. Intentions don't change your life. Execution does. And execution isn't complicated. It's simple, but not easy. It's doing what needs to be done, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you don't feel ready. Because readiness is a trap. Most people wait until they feel ready, but that feeling rarely comes. Confidence doesn't come before action. It comes from action. Clarity doesn't come before action. It comes from action. Momentum doesn't come before action. It comes from action. So if you're waiting to feel ready, you'll be waiting for a long time. The people who move forward aren't the ones who feel ready. They're the ones who act anyway. And through that action, they figure things out. They adjust. They improve. They grow. That's how progress actually works. Not perfectly, not in a straight line, but through movement. Constant, imperfect movement. And over time, that movement builds something powerful. Experience. Experience teaches you what works, what doesn't, what needs to change, what needs to improve. And that feedback loop is what drives real growth. Because once you start paying attention to results, instead of just effort, you begin to refine your approach. You stop repeating mistakes. You start making better decisions. You become more effective. And effectiveness multiplies your results. At that point, you're no longer just working hard. You're working smart. And when those two combine, hard work and smart direction, the results become inevitable. But there's something important to understand here. This process requires patience, because while direction can change quickly, results take time. And during that time, doubt will try to come back. It will tell you, maybe this isn't working. Maybe you should go back. Maybe this is too much. That's normal, because growth challenges your old identity. The version of you that avoided discomfort, that settled for less, that stayed in familiar patterns. That version doesn't disappear instantly. It resists. It tries to pull you back into old habits, back into comfort, back into what feels easy. And that's where the real test begins, not when things are going well, but when they're not. When progress slows, when results aren't immediate, when effort feels heavy, that's when your commitment is tested. And in those moments, you have two options: return to what's familiar or continue toward what's possible. Most people go back, not because they want to, but because it's easier. But the ones who don't, the ones who keep going, even when it's hard, even when it's uncertain, those are the ones who break through, because they understand something critical. Temporary discomfort is the price of permanent growth, and avoiding that discomfort is what keeps people stuck. So instead of running from it, they move toward it, they lean into it. Because they know on the other side of that discomfort is a different version of themselves, stronger, more capable, more disciplined. And once you experience that growth, something shifts permanently. You start to trust yourself more, not because everything is easy, but because you've proven that you can handle difficulty. That trust is powerful because it removes fear, not completely, but enough. Enough to take action, enough to take risks, enough to keep moving forward. And once fear no longer controls your decisions, your potential expands. You start aiming higher. You start pushing further. You start expecting more from yourself. And that expectation changes your behavior because you rise to the standard you set. If your standard is low, your actions will match it. If your standard is high, your actions will rise to meet it. That's why raising your standard is one of the most powerful things you can do. Not occasionally, but consistently. Because standards aren't what you say, they're what you practice. And over time, those practices define your life. They determine your results, your habits, your identity, and eventually, your future. So the real question isn't, what do you want? The real question is, what are you willing to require from yourself? Because that answer will determine everything. Will you require consistency or accept inconsistency? Will you require discipline or accept excuses? Will you require growth or accept comfort? Those choices, made daily, shape your entire life. And the moment you stop negotiating them, everything changes. Because now, you're not hoping for a better life. You're building one, not slowly drifting into the future, but intentionally creating it. Step by step, decision by decision, action by action. And one day, you'll look back again. But this time, the answer to that question will be different. What has changed? Everything. Not because of luck, not because of perfect conditions, but because you decided to stop staying the same. And that decision, followed by consistent action, changed the direction of your life. That's how it happens. Quietly, gradually, powerfully. And it all starts the same way it always does, with a single moment where you choose to move forward.